Welcome to Jared Scott Outdoors. This YouTube channel is dedicated to getting our youth more involved in the outdoors. To do this, I'll be out with family and friends doing all sorts of outdoor adventures. We're heading out on a late buck hunt. I was fortunate enough to draw a tag, one of the controlled hunt tags, in a unit that doesn't have really hard odds to put in for. I thought, I'm going to try one of these units that are a little easier to draw, and I got lucky and drew. So this is going to be a November hunt. Starts November 10th and goes to the 25th. So basically about 2 weeks there to see if we can get one in. Now this means that this hunt is right during the middle of the rut. When those muleys are coming out, the big ones are coming out of the woodwork and they're following those does, and hopefully it's getting to where we can get some opportunities to take a great big one. Either way, I'm hoping to get some good fun action, see a bunch of rutting going on and find some big bucks. So let's get after it and see what we can do. The opening day of the season found me with my son Luke trying to gain some elevation to spot some deer we had seen the evening before. It was a very cold morning in the single digits as a cold front had just blown through along with several inches of fresh snow. Those dark spots you see in the sagebrush are actually about a dozen deer. With the spotting scope I could make out an average buck in the group. In this patch of trees were a couple more deer, one doe and one small buck.
Neither one of them are outside the ears, really not what we're looking for, so we're going to hurry back up so we can get warmed up and keep going.
Just as we were nearing the ridge we had hoped to glass some deer in that were a little closer, we spotted about 100 elk heading our way. They appeared to have just been spooked as they were moving pretty quickly. Shortly afterwards, we heard a couple shots from some other hunters that must have found a decent buck to harvest. We took advantage of the elk coming our way and watched as they all passed by on their way to higher ground. This 5x5 bull was the biggest with 4 spikes mixed in with the cows. Looking down into the draw below us, we didn't see anything at first, but slowly, deer started coming out of the woodwork. A young buck with a few does was at the bottom of the canyon, but about halfway up we watched this young 2-point buck cover a good mile as it was on the trail of another doe in heat. It acted like a hound dog as it was covering ground fast, following the path the doe had taken hours earlier. Another group of does materialized, but there was nothing with antlers in this group. While we watched and waited, Luke took advantage of the break to get some more energy by eating his lunch. This is when a doe in heat came out of the trees, followed closely by a 3-point buck. The doe didn't seem interested and kept moving away, but the buck wasn't about to let the doe out of its sight as it stayed right with it. Later we watched as the young 2-point we had seen earlier came out of the trees on the same trail of this doe. Apparently it was the one leaving the scent trail it was following so hard. Little did it know, a bigger buck was way ahead of him. A couple hours later, as we hiked over into some new country, we spotted another herd of deer about 1,000 yards away. Using the spotting scope, we found 2 bucks in the group. One wasn't too big, but the other caught my attention and needed a better look. It was definitely the biggest buck we'd seen so far. It had good height in the back, but was pretty weak in the front.
There were 2 bucks down there. One was a 4x4 and one was a 3x4. The biggest one was roughly around 24 inches, but they weren't quite what we were looking for.
As we rounded the next finger ridge, we stumbled onto the herd of elk we'd seen earlier. The closest were only about 40 yards away bedded down, but they saw us at the same time. So once again, we found ourselves watching a lot of elk as the bulk of the herd tried to figure out what made the others jump out of their beds. Eventually, they all worked over the next ridge and out of sight. Covering more ground to another point, we set up the spotting scope and started combing over the area again.
Well, we've got 2 groups way out there, about a mile out. One's a small 4x4, the other's kind of an average 4x4, just out past its ears, just a little bit. Not very tall, however. The last one over here, he was quite a bit taller, but just didn't have the mass or size, and this 4x4 doesn't either. Not a lot of height or mass to it. So we are seeing a lot. We've seen well over a dozen bucks, but it's a lot of this, so it's hard to show you guys that because they're so far away.
Considering the conditions we were hiking in today, it was quite a feat for Luke to hike all the way to this high point. So we stopped for a minute and took a few photos and then set back to glassing for more deer. We saw a few others, but nothing too big. With the sun starting to go down in the west, we headed off down the mountain back to the truck. 1 week later found me back in the hills looking for a big buck. After a couple hours of hiking, I spotted a few does down below me in a draw. As I watched, a buck fed into view along with a few other does. The buck was a 4-point, but like so many I'd already seen, it was just a young one. I still enjoyed watching it for a bit, especially as it was using some of its extra energy to rake this one lone pine tree on the hillside. Eventually the buck bedded down, and this was my cue to sneak off in search of other deer and hopefully a mature buck. I didn't see any more deer for hours, even though I covered several miles. The only animals I found was this pair of raghorn bulls. They didn't like my presence on their quiet mountain and decided to find some new country. Eventually I started seeing some tracks in the snow and then suddenly jumped a few deer out in front of me. Not knowing what was going on, they hung out for a while, allowing me to pull out the camera. The buck running with these does was actually a pretty tall buck. It was a 4x4 with tall backs and very weak fronts. It even had a small kicker on its left side. As you can tell, it's still a younger buck with its spread not quite as wide as its ears. But with this being a late hunt and hopes of a big mature buck, I had to let it go. Later that day, with just an hour left of light, a few deer materialized out of the brush below me. Right off the bat, I could tell that one of the bucks was a decent one. I watched as it ran off a small 2-point as well as a 3-point buck. My first impression was that while it was a nice buck, it still wasn't quite what I wanted, but I decided to sneak in for a closer look. Closing the distance, I watched as it chased a doe in heat all over the hillside. Like those I'd seen earlier, the doe didn't seem to want anything to do with it and just kept on the move. Undeterred, however, the buck stayed on its heels and never let it out of its sight. Meanwhile, it didn't seem to give any thought to the other does watching the action. This buck was probably one of the best bucks I'd seen so far. Both the front and the back forks were about evenly sized, but it didn't have a lot of height to it. While it was the biggest I'd seen, it was still probably just a 160 class buck at best. With the sun setting, I reluctantly opted to let it go and headed off towards the truck as I had several miles to cover. The next morning found me once again on a high ridge overlooking a lot of country. I had started hiking well before light so I could be at a good vantage point to glass from. The ridge proved to be a great spot to set up the spotting scope as I could indeed see lots of country in all directions.
All I found so far is one little spike. So I'm just not quite sure what's going on. When I talked with the fishing game, it sounds like most of them actually migrate out into a different unit to winter. And it might be that we're late enough that most of them are gone right now.
Well, I drove around looking for other areas that piqued my interest, but in the end was just disappointed with everything I found as I didn't find anything too promising. Realizing my chances were pretty slim to find a bigger buck before my hunt ended, I reluctantly decided to go back after that 4-point I'd passed the night before to see if I could find it again. Making it up on the ridge where I should be able to see the buck again, I snuck into a good viewing area where I expected to be able to see the group of deer below me, assuming they were in the same drainage. To my surprise, after looking the canyon over several times, I couldn't find a single deer.
Well, as luck would have it, they're not here anymore. I can see a lot of country in the areas they were at, but I haven't seen a stinking deer. So I'll keep my eyes open, but not looking too good. It's the last day of the hunt for me. You saw I decided to go back and get that 4-point that I passed on last weekend and couldn't find it again, so I'm out now. This is my last day. It's either going to happen now or it's not. So, you know, initially I was hoping to get one of those 180 kind of bucks, but with the amount of deer I'm seeing, the amount of bucks, the odds of finding one that big are just pretty slim. I'm sure you got to find at least 100 bucks or so before you're going to find one of those great big bucks, and I'm just not finding that many deer, that many bucks. So odds are definitely against me of finding a big one. Realistically, if I can find a decent 4-point, I think I probably better take it.
After hiking up a little bit to where I had a good vantage point, I spotted a few does clear up near the top.
Now there's a fairly nice 4-point, pretty tall in the back, kind of weak in the front. A few does, another little 2-point. As I glassed over, another 4-point was coming from the left on the top and has now joined them. It's strong in the front, weak in the back. Anyways, I've got several deer up there. I was really hoping I could just glass and you know, they'd be lower, but they're up clear at the top, which is about 2,000 feet from where I parked. So I've made it about a quarter of the way. I've got a long ways to go.
This was steep country with no easy way around it. I just have to hoof it up as quickly as I could. Of course, I use the word quickly very loosely, as in reality it would take a long, hard grind to gain the elevation needed to get in on these deer. Every now and then I would peek over to make sure the deer were still around. At one point I watched as one of the 4-points was run off by the other. The other deer then disappeared behind the rocky outcropping. I could only assume that they would stick around and just kept working up the mountain. Nearing the top, I ran into this young forky that saw me as well. I was nervous he would warn the others if he ran in their direction, but fortunately, it went the opposite way. I took advantage of seeing it to take a much-needed break, and then once it was out of sight, I continued on up to the top. I was starting to question my luck because as soon as I reached the top and swung over to the position where I should be able to see the deer below me, the clouds rolled in. As luck would have it, these clouds filled the entire canyon, making visibility extremely low. I couldn't see more than 50 yards in front of me at times, let alone the 300 yards or so I expected the deer to be from my position.
I've got a few other deer over here bedded down I saw before, during a little break in the clouds there, but I'll check them out, and I'm just hunkered down right now out of the wind, just waiting for these clouds to go because I really can't do anything. It's just kind of a waiting game, so I hope I don't lose my chance. Hopefully they don't slip out on me while I'm waiting for these to leave, but I can't risk getting in too close and having them wind me and bugger out, without me being able to see them with the poor visibility I've got. So we'll just kind of wait and see what happens.
In the foggy conditions, I nearly walked onto a few deer with this little forky being the only buck in sight. I slowly snuck back and out of sight. Over the course of a few hours, I carefully checked other draws and found several groups of deer below me. As I had been finding at least one buck with each group of deer, I expected to find more bucks to check out. Surprisingly, however, out of the 40 deer I saw in several groups, I couldn't find any other bucks. The lack of bucks with all those does only helped to solidify my decision to take one of the first bucks that I had seen that morning if I could find them again. When the clouds finally lifted, I hurried over to a vantage point to try to find the group of deer with the bucks. Sure enough, with just a couple hours left of light in the day, I found them and quickly made a plan to sneak within range of a shot. As I neared the point I hoped to see them from, I chambered a shell and carefully worked in closer. It took a few minutes to find them in the sagebrush, as most of them were still bedded down, but they were there, just over 200 yards away. Grabbing the camera, I decided to get a little footage of them first. I watched as another buck joined the group of deer. It was a 3-point, but only had one antler. About as quickly as it got in there, the bigger buck chased it off. The other 4-point was also back. Between the one-sided 3-point and the younger 4-point, that kept the big one busy trying to keep claim of the half-dozen does he had. Each time he would chase one off, the other would work back in on the other side. Finally, the smaller 4-point decided to leave and started to head up the hill. I was worried it would see me and then warn the others, so I figured I'd better go ahead and take the bigger buck before I lost my chance. As I was by myself, I set the camera down on my backpack so I could focus on getting the shot. It took a little repositioning before I had a clear shot over the sagebrush in front of me, and just as I was about to pull the trigger, it bedded down. I only had to wait a few minutes, however, as the one-sided 3-point got too close to its does again and the buck stood up and chased it off. As it worked back to the does, it paused for a moment, giving me the shot angle I was looking for, and I pulled the trigger.
And this is my last day, so it's 1 hour left of daylight. That'll give me enough time to get down to it and get started on it and start heading on down. That's a good thing it's downhill, but this was a tough hunt. I learned a little bit here on this one. I put in for a lower odds kind of hunt, or a better chance of drawing it kind of hunt, and now I know why. The deer there's not a lot of deer, and then there's not a lot of big ones. And so that's why I realized, all right, I've got to take the next nice one that comes along, because it's not gonna get any better. So I'm real happy with that. I guess I don't have to keep whispering anymore. It's done now, but. Anyway, just an incredible time up here. It was hard. The country, however, is beautiful. As hard as it was, it's just so quiet right now. And I'm up on the tops of these mountains here, and you can just look across forever right now because the clouds are finally gone. But it's just beautiful and peaceful, and what a way to end this hunt. So I'm real excited about this. So I'm going to head down and check out the buck now.
I should have done a better job of making some mental notes of where it went down, as it took me several minutes to find it in the thick sagebrush. I did find it, however, and was happy with what I found. Well, here you go. Here's the buck. It was a lot of work to get this guy. We found him this morning, hiked all day, got stuck in the clouds. I climbed well over 2,000 feet to get above him and to try to find him, and then had the clouds come in and just totally sock me in. And it wasn't till just about getting close to dark that I was able to find him again. Saw lots of other does, just didn't find any other bucks that were bigger than a 2-point. So came back and found him and figured, you know, there's no way I'm going to find one bigger than this with the last day right now. So went ahead and took him. So just a fantastic hunt, ended it well, and you know, I'm real happy. If you liked what you saw, please subscribe to the Jared Scott Outdoors YouTube channel.